A year ago, I tried to, in the Great Stretch, which was my talk about Chilean wine 1 year ago, I tried to define what I thought Chilean Cabernet in particular is about. It's always impressed me as being unique and different. And it always has huge colour, and it always has vibrant fruit, the best examples, and the tannins are different, and you always know that you're facing something very concentrated and very serious in Chilean Cabernet. And it's different to anything produced anywhere else on the globe. And I think you might even see that in this tasting. Next slide. This is all in your printed notes. Cabernet, the variety, we all know is a noble variety, a great variety, one of the greatest varieties. Wine Chile, I'm sure Michael wrote these words, is Chile star grape. And from that very weighty and worthy tome, wine grapes, Jancis et al. Have said the world's best travelled variety. We know it's now almost damned as an international variety in favour of indigenous varieties, which Chile doesn't have and Australia doesn't have and South Africa doesn't have. There's a sort of weighted advantage to indigenous varieties that lands heavily in Europe. The next slide. Cabernet, again, elucidated beautifully in wine grapes. Cabernet, its origins, its siblings, its relationships, incestuous as they are. Cabernet is Cabernet Franc as a father, maybe, could be the mother. Sauvignon Blanc, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Magdalene Noir, and Cabernet Franc and Gros Cabernet. Why I put this up is that Cabernet Franc has delivered into all of these varieties a green gene. And if Cabernet has a fault, it is that in wet soils and wet vintages, cool conditions, cool damp conditions, it expresses itself as green. And we all know what that is. It's isobutyl methoxypyrazine, pyrazine for short. And let's go on to the next slide. And in order of ranking, of ripening, Merlot is first thanks to its mother, which is the earliest ripening variety, I believe, harvested in France, and it has the least greenness. Cabernet Franc is the next to ripen and has the second least greenness. And down we go to Cabernet and then poor old Carmenere, which inherits green gene from father, Cabernet Franc, and from mother, Cabernet Gros, which is a grandchild of Cabernet Franc. So it inherits it on two sides in this incestuous relationship. It's the greenest of all. But we do know how to control that greenness. We know where to plant, how to grow, how to leaf strip the canopy at the appropriate time. And Kees van Leeuwen from Bordeaux had a lot to do with elucidating all of this. He did an experiment with Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Cabernet across 3 vintages and across a gravel soil, a sandy soil, and a clay soil, and he came up with the conclusions that Cabernet has the most colour, has the most tannin, has the most malic acid, all of those Cabernet-related varieties, and it grows best in those soils where water deficits are strongest. And at the end, he says, these conditions are most frequently met on shallow or stony soils in moderately dry climates. And that's where Cabernet does best and where the green gene doesn't express so strongly. So we'll go next. To again characterise Cabernet, and quote again from Wine Grapes, Cabernet has a particularly powerful identity. Now in this tasting, we have blends. Cabernet is always the dominant variety, but it is in there in partnership with other members of the Cabernet family, with Merlot, with Cabernet Franc, with other near relatives like Malbec, and then completely unrelated Shiraz and Petit Verdot. All of those varieties are found in this tasting in some combination somewhere with Cabernet, but Cabernet will be the dominant variety in each of these wines. And as Wine Grape says, what is remarkable about Cabernet Sauvignon is that it imprints its identity so firmly on any wine that includes it. And I think you'll find that in these wines. And Cabernet gets, in some of them, will be just over the 50% mark. Wine grapes goes further and establishes the Medoc, Grave, Penedès, Napa, Bulgari, Sonoma, Santa Cruz, Washington State, Punto Alto in Chile, Coonawarra, Margaret River. If you added to that the triangle, the Golden Triangle in South Africa, and the Gimlet Gravels in New Zealand, which I'm sure the authors of wine grapes would permit, then you have our tasting. All of the wines would come from those areas that are nominated by wine grapes as being the great areas for Cabernet, plus South Africa, Stellenbosch, Golden Triangle, plus Hawke's Bay, New Zealand. So you have the range. Next slide. Okay, the soils of all the areas, and these, and again, this is in your paper, so I'm not going to run through each of them, but if you quickly look at them, they all answer Kees van Leeuwen's description of being either shallow or stony, free-drained, dry soils. And there's a remarkable consistency through those soil types of being quaternary gravels, something laid down in the last 2 million years in the ice ages by rivers, colluvial fans, those sorts of things. Very specific circumstances, and in each of them, in the Medoc and in Grave, in Maipo Alto and in Aconcagua, in the Montebello Ridge, which is a very special circumstance, in the Golden Triangle of Stellenbosch, in Margaret River and Coonawarra, in Bulgari, where Sassicaia is, and finally the Havelock Hills of Hawke's Bay in New Zealand. The soils answer Kees van Leeuwen's description. On to the next. What we do have, having looked at the soil and geology, is a huge diversity of climate, and climate is the most important parameter of terroir. It's not to say that geology and soil aren't important, they are. They're the finer tuning knobs of terroir, but just to run through this very quickly, the heat summation ranges from the very hot at Stellenbosch, 1945, through to 1360 degree days in Hawke's Bay, and everything in between. And you'll see that Coonawarra and Santa Cruz Mountains are around the 1400 mark, so they're actually cooler than the Medoc and Pomerol. And then there's a group of in Chile, Maipo and Aconcagua, and in Bulgari at around the 1600 mark and 1700 mark. Now that, you think about that, you go from 1360 to nearly 2000, there's 600 plus degree days difference between Stellenbosch and Hawke's Bay. There's 212 days in the growing season, so that's plus 3 degrees every day warmer in Stellenbosch than in Hawke's Bay. So there's a huge diversity of climates here, and you might see that coming through, you may not, coming through those wines. What is often underestimated is the diurnal range, and the diurnal range is the next column, and you'll see it ranges again at the low end in the very maritime climate of Hawke's Bay, 9 degrees between day and night temperature on average throughout the growing season, right up to 19 in the Aconcagua Valley. And I'm going to show you what that means in a minute. Basically, in the very low diurnal range places, the plant can work day and night, ripens quicker, gets more tannin, less colour, different sorts of fruit characters. Now in those very high diurnal range places, everything stops at night, so ripening is very prolonged, and you can only do it in places where the rain doesn't start in April or in September as it does in Bordeaux or in Hawke's Bay. So those very high diurnal range places need very dry climates that last right into the winter, through the autumn and into the winter to get the grapes ripe. The grapes have a different set of characters, more colour than out of the out of the maritime climates, much more intense colours. They have a different fruit character, a more briary and a more intense fruit character, perhaps not as complex. And perhaps some of these things you'll see as you go through these wines. Let me just give you the last slide, which demonstrates how important diurnal range is. It's very underestimated. I compared in Aconcagua the Senya site, which is Ochoa, and Margaret River. You can see they basically have pretty much the same heat summation, 1685 and 1648. The diurnal range is vastly different, 19 degrees in the Aconcagua and 11.2 in Margaret River. That translates, if you work through the mathematics and you do the simultaneous equations, which I actually did and probably haven't done since for 40 years, works out that in the Aconcagua, the maximum temperature every day is 27.5. That's the average across all days of the growing season. Whereas in Margaret River, it's only 23.4. So much, even though they've got the same heat summation, the days are much cooler in Margaret River than in Aconcagua. That doesn't mean it's better. It just means it produces a different style of wine. And that 4-degree difference translates again, if you multiply it by 212, but you've also got to divide by a 2 because it's an average. It translates into something like 400 or 500 degree days difference during the day in Chile as opposed to New Zealand. And on the other side of the coin, vines stop metabolizing at 10 degrees. The average temperature at night in Aconcagua is 8.5, so the vine is virtually closed down every night, whereas in Margaret River it's at 12.2, so the plant is still working at night right through the growing season, and that drives some of these differences. That, in brief summary, is what you have in front of you. Peter's going to talk to how these wines are presented. All I'd like to say is that I have just gone, climate change, we're all going through climate change. We know that's really important. I've gone through climate shock in the last 2 days. In Australia, we're having some of the hottest weather ever. In Moomba and Oodnadatta, they've recorded nearly 50 degrees centigrade and have had 2 weeks on the end at 45 degrees plus. You know about the fires in Tasmania, vineyard areas affected. Hobart reached 41. It does that about every 7 or 8 years. It gets up to that temperature, but this was particularly dramatic. Fortunately, where we live, the hot air seems to float around us. There's no hot air in Adelaide, is all I can say. And we've had quite a mild summer by comparison to everybody else. If that was in the news, the other piece of news I picked up off my computer this morning, which I think is very newsworthy indeed, is that you people in the UK have finally broken the average of £5 per bottle, and wine is finally selling for £5 and 3 pence on average in this country. Thank you very much. You'll give us an upper end so we can start to make some profit again. Over to you, Peter.
Great. Thanks, Brian.